Welcome to Question Mark, the podcast, exploring the greatest story ever told with open minds and open hearts.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.
Well, hello and welcome. I feel I should say yet again to Question Mark, a fortnightly podcast about Mark's Gospel, the greatest story ever told. The countdown has begun. There are only 3 more episodes after this one, and then we're finished. And we were just discussing what we do next, and who knows? So watch this space. Don't go away. Anyway, we're very pleased that you chose to spend a few minutes with us today, and hope you will feel it was worthwhile. I'm sure you will. My name's David Payne, and I'll be your host for this, the 65th episode then, in our journey through Mark's Gospel. Today, we're delighted to have Phil Ruge-Jones from Wisconsin. Good afternoon, Phil. And Stephen Smart, of course. Phil, I'm told you are a leading light in the network of biblical storytellers, which doesn't mean anything to us in England, really, because we don't, apart from a few people who do this kind of thing, we don't have that very much. Steph tells me you were a great help to him at the beginning when he was setting out on this adventure. So we're very grateful for that. And do you do this all the time? Is it your day job? Tell us a bit about it. Who are you? What do you do? And
so I was a college professor for 18 years, a university professor in Texas at a Lutheran university. And my wife and I decided it was time to move closer to where family are our parents. And so 7 years ago, I moved back up to Wisconsin, and I'm a pastor of a small congregation. And I do some other work. I go twice a year to Guatemala to work on a translation project. So and I perform the Gospel of Mark in its entirety. So I learn stories in Spanish, share them and study them with a group of 15 people and other people like myself in Guatemala. And then in the afternoon, they take the storytelling in Spanish that we've heard and convert it into storytelling in 3 different languages, Ma, Michil, and Sipacapense, to take back to their communities who are primarily oral speaking communities to experience the word in a living way. And so, but it's a translation project. It's not a paraphrase project. I like how Stefan always says it's a word for word, just to let people know you're not making things up as you go. I'm a member of an organization called the Network of Biblical Storytellers International. Much of what happens in the United States. We gather once a year with about 150, 200 people who learn biblical stories by heart in order to tell them publicly. And we do this as a ministry, but also as a spiritual discipline and as a way of understanding the word. And I played a role for a while in a group of professional level storytellers and scholars who'd get together before the big event and discuss what happens when we each show up with what we know and have a conversation. So, and performances, always performances. So.
Brilliant. And so a couple of other guests, I believe Cliff Barbrick's taken over from you in doing what you were doing. Mm-hmm. And Tracy, I can't pronounce her surname.
Tracy Radosovic was the dean of, there's an academy where you can perfect your art. And so I got a certificate under her tutelage. And she's a leading light for sure in that work as well.
I think she's 2 guests time, Steph, isn't she? As far as I remember, but yeah, something like that. Thank you, Phil. It's lovely to have you with us, and I hope I got your name right. I couldn't manage Tracy's, but I got yours right anyway. And Steph Smart. The last podcast we did was just before you left for the Edinburgh Fringe, and now you're back. I'm sure many of your listeners have followed you on Facebook and so on, but do just tell us, how did it go?
It was wonderful. I think I haven't quite recovered, but I'm on the way. I really am. I've had a complete break since I've come back. In fact, I slept for 2 days and 2 nights, believe it or not, more or less continuously. But it was a phenomenal experience, and it had its highs and its lows. I had moments when it got pretty desperate when only about 9 or 10 people would come along to the show, and I'm thinking, oh, that's not very many after a really good start. But things really picked up into the second week, and it was full houses all the way through to the end. But I think the most important thing for me was just the excitement of sharing that experience of the word coming alive for people. You could see it on their faces, and that is such a joy to watch how hearing this word and watching it embodied brings the Bible alive. So yeah, it was completely exhausting, but I would definitely do it again.
I couldn't believe your schedule. When I looked at it, I was like, oh my gosh.
I know.
One performance puts me on the floor. I can't imagine doing 2 in a day or back to back days. That was phenomenal.
That's right. And in the middle of it, Phil, my mum was seriously ill, and she doesn't live in Edinburgh. She lives a long way from Edinburgh. So I had to take a couple of days off, where luckily I had a break, and go to Watford and then come back again. So it was even more exhausting than I anticipated. But you're right, it is tough. It is tough doing it day after day. But I don't know about you, Phil, but I find doing the performance, it does drain you, but at the same time, it energizes you, because it is the word of God. And it's so moving and so powerful that even as a performer, even if you've done it many times, it still grabs you, doesn't it?
Yeah, for sure.
I tell you what, while we're talking about that, can I ask my first question, which is before other people get in, which is, what is it about the performing of Mark's gospel, or of scripture generally, that is so much more powerful than reading? Because most of us read the Bible. Not many of us will even have seen it, let alone done it ourselves. Phil, what is it? You're clearly committed to it and been doing it for years.
So both as a performer and as an audience, I think there's a different experience.
Yeah.
And so let me just touch on a few things. First of all, it's eye contact. This is a human story being communicated by humans about important events that have shaped humanity. So that's an element of it. There's a greater emotional range when you're doing it. I had one of my students, I used to teach a course where 15 students each learned 4 stories from Mark, and at the end of the semester, we'd perform it. And one of my students had a brilliant observation. He said, I've known from child, I've been taught that Jesus became fully human, but I didn't understand what that meant until I embodied all the emotions that my 4 stories carried. And so you just see the range of life that Jesus lived, what his day-to-day, you step into what his day-to-day experiences must have been like, and make you experience a connection with God through doing that. One thing I was thinking about, because of what we were just saying about how exhausting it is, one of the first things I noticed when I first was performing the whole thing is it really was hard. I almost never made it through before my first public appearance, the entire gospel, because I was so exhausted by the end. And I've come to believe that that's part of the dynamic of the story that you would never get reading, that Jesus is spent by the end of the story. And so is the storyteller. And yeah, you're energized because the ending is near, the ending, but like physically you're drained. And I think that actually contributes to the dynamic of the story. That's part of the dynamic.
I think I better say at this point, Phil, that I rarely do the whole thing. So the one in Edinburgh was a truncated version. So perhaps that's why I lasted so long before collapsing. But yeah, I can see what you mean about all 16 chapters and the spent quality that you feel at the end.
It's about 2 hours in my telling, with a 10-minute break in there.
Yeah.
Thank you both. But today's passage is so important. It's what Jesus has been working towards. And many would say it's the central point of history, along with the resurrection. And there's certainly going to be plenty to talk about, which we're going to do once Phil has performed it for us. If you want to see him and get the eye contact, even through Zoom, and not just listen, you might want to watch this on YouTube, listener. Phil, over to you for the death of Jesus.
All right. At 12 o'clock, darkness came over the whole land until 3. And at 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out in a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which means, my my God, why have you abandoned me?" And some of those who were standing by said, "Look, he's calling for Elijah." And one of them got a sponge drugged with cheap wine, put it on a reed staff, and offered it to him, saying, "Leave him alone. Let's see if Elijah comes to take him down." And Jesus let out a loud cry, died. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom. Now, when the centurion, the executioner, who stood opposite Jesus, saw how he had died, he said, "Truthfully, this was Son of God." Now, there were women watching from a distance. There was Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James the Younger, and Joseph, and Salome, all who had followed Jesus and served with him in Galilee. And there were many other women who'd come up with him to Jerusalem.
Thank you, Phil. That was marvelous and gave our normal reader, Lucy, a day off as well. Thank you. Right. Phil, what is the first thing that strikes you about this passage then?
So to me, this passage gets at the heart of what's going on, that what God is doing as God's reign is entering the world through Jesus. And it's that there's something very powerful about Jesus in his moment of most desolating weakness. So to me, that's the heart of the matter. And let me just share. I have lots of stories about this, but I'll start with one. When I was a professor in the university, I shared this passage, and a woman in the front row started crying, and I was like, "Oh, how lovely!" Right? She's moved by this tender and important story. And she came to my office later, and she said, "I just wanted to let you know what was going on." I said, "Okay, tell me." And she said, when she was 10 years old, someone was supposed to be taking care of her, and instead he held her at knife point and violated her. And she said, "I always thought that God didn't understand what happened to me. But when I heard Jesus cry out from the cross, I said, I know that cry. That's my cry." And so it didn't resolve everything for her. It didn't mean that, oh, good, that wasn't a bad thing after all, or anything like that. But it gave her a context to take seriously the violence that had done to her in her life, and to feel a connection with God in a moment that had, until this narrative shaped her hearing, felt God forsaken, God abandoned. And so I think that's Jesus isn't just showing that he has power, unlike other people who claim power, but he's redefining power for us. And for me, this is the moment where it happens most profoundly.
I think you're exploring the humanity of Jesus in your answer to that question, aren't you? And that's what resonates so powerfully, that God became man and suffered as we suffer. In fact, he suffered the extremes
right.
of our suffering. So he's a God who puts himself down to our level, who humbles himself. He's not some supreme deity who rules on high.
Right.
He is
From a distance.
alongside us. So yeah, it's very powerful, that passage and that particular quotation, which Jesus talks in Aramaic. And I think you can't get away from the pastoral implications of that, which you've brilliantly suggested. I think if I was to start anyway, it would be on the same example, though, because I think it is the central bit of this passage. And the way I'm getting to understand it these days, though, it picks up a different phenomenon. I remember performing it myself, and a lady said at the end, when we were having a discussion, "You know, this isn't just Jesus's suffering that's depicted here. You know that, don't you? And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, actually, what Jesus is saying is Psalm 22. And that got me thinking. And the more I've thought about it and talked about it with friends like John Burnett, who's often a guest on this podcast, it seems to me that the scriptural reference is deliberate on Mark's part. It's not that Jesus is just sharing his despair and dereliction, but there's a theological aspect to this as well. Psalm 22, as I'm sure you know, Phil, it's like resonate. It happens all the way through this particular part of Jesus's life, the crucifixion, the men who cast lots to see which clothes they would get, the people who were on the edge of the scene, shaking their heads and abusing him with their words. All of those are direct references to Psalm 22. And this is another example. And I don't know if this is right, but it really feels like it's something important to consider. That for Mark, as I understand it, when he mentions a line of scripture, it's to say, read the rest. It's to imply it's not just one line, it's the whole thing you need to read. And if we read Psalm 22, what we notice is it starts with this cry of abandonment, yes, and goes into great detail about the suffering of the narrator in that psalm, but ends in triumph. It talks about how God, through this sufferer, exerts dominion over the whole of the earth, that even those who rise from the dead will consider him to be the Lord. All of these things kind of remind us of what Jesus's destiny is to be. That this isn't just a man suffering on a cross, or even God suffering on a cross and feeling abandoned, but it's about God's purpose in sending Jesus and who Jesus is to bring creation together under him and for him to be acclaimed as the Lord of all. And so this piece of writing, however powerful it is emotionally for us, however much we can connect it with our human experience, it feels to me it's like it's even more important as to the meaning of these events, as well as its emotional impact on us. And I think, just so that it feels perhaps a little bit more compelling, it's just, I've noticed this recently, that Jesus's cry isn't his only cry. There's another one just before he dies. And in the Greek, I think the two words, in the NIV, it says, he shouted with a loud voice, which is the bit we're talking about. And in the NIV, it says, Jesus gave a loud voice and a loud cry and he died. But actually, the original word, which translated cry there, is the same word as the one used to describe the quotation we've been talking about. In other words, it's the same expression. And I wonder whether what Mark is implying there is that Jesus said the whole psalm from the cross, the whole psalm. And his final words would have been, therefore, he has done it, which is the end of Psalm 22, which is very similar to John's gospel, where it says, it is finished, as Jesus's last words. So there's something really, really powerful going on.
Yeah, I wouldn't go there with you. So I think that I'm not saying that Mark doesn't have that full understanding in his head, but he shows such restraint to not give us any real clues that this is going to be resolved, that to me, that's the part of the power and weakness that he says, of course I could tell you the whole psalm, but I'm going to let you hang there in the moment of need, because it makes a difference. Too quickly the church moves to, and this, right? When you suffer a loved one, there's always people willing to come and give you consolation way earlier than that, without having entered with you into the suffering and the struggle. And so I think Mark is making that that clear. And then the resurrection story, which I won't steal the next person's thunder, right? But it's also kind of leaves us hanging. And of course, Mark believes that Jesus is risen, but Jesus doesn't show up in the oldest passages of the resurrection. And so let me do what I think is happening divine there. And this is me. I'm not saying this is Mark, but I have this notion in my head that Jesus and God have this conversation and says, I've been trying to tell the people that there's nowhere they can go where I won't show up. And they don't believe me. And he's like, well, yeah, you've sent prophets and you've sent the word to tell them and they still don't seem to get it. And God says, I have an idea though, but you're not going to like it. And Jesus says, well, go ahead, tell me. And he says, what if you experienced what they experienced, like unbuffered? You experienced the fullness of what it feels like to be God forsaken. And so there's a mutual agreement between Jesus and God that he will experience in an unbuffered way, like a rupture in the Godhead, and will experience what it's like to not feel God's presence as people regularly do. But he'll do that as God's son that's sent. Yeah. And so you get in one person the absence of God and the presence of God. And then God, this is in it's kind of like a little Wizard of Oz image. He's standing behind the curtain and he's like, I don't want to do this. In fact, it's harder for God to show to follow through on the commitment than it is Jesus. I want to be there for my son. I don't want him to die alone. I don't want him to feel that absence. But that's the commitment that's made so that this opening in the Godhead can be real. And as soon as Jesus dies, the commitment has been kept. God rips the curtain temple and is on the loose and goes, and in my imagination, catches the son in his death and embraces him. And so I too want to have some level of resolution, and it's essential that Jesus isn't just another one more of the billions who have died horrible deaths, but that he enters that fully is for me at least very important.
I think you can have both. I think there's I think it's a Jewish rabbi's proverb, isn't it, that where two interpretations fit, you should mention both. And I agree with what you said. There's nothing I dispute. And I would say too that Jesus' humanity, which we're talking about here, is very clear in earlier parts of the story, particularly at Gethsemane. It's so clear to see. So you can't ignore this point of view.
We've got one or two questions. I can probably get two in here, which go with this. Gareth's asking what this passage, my God, why have you forsaken me, does for our understanding of Trinity, and also why they think he's calling out to Elijah. We've mentioned Psalm 22, so it clearly is that. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts about either of those, Phil.
I've talked a little bit about what I think
yes.
In my head. So Mark isn't thinking Trinity. I don't think, there's 300 years before that's fully developed in the way we think about it, but we do. And so we think about it backwards. So I see this tension and rupture in the Godhead happening. So that Jürgen Moltmann did a lot of writing about this out of World War II and his own sense that how do Germans make sense of our collaboration with the Nazis and the violence that happened. And he sees this is like his point of departure for a book called The Crucified God. And he's seeing this as a ripping apart of the Godhead in order to create space for us to enter in. And then the resurrection's affirming Jesus is indeed the one sent by God, in spite of all evidence that the cross presents. So I see that a little bit. I guess that's what I would say in terms of the Godhead. There's some open, and that it's not an idea that God opened God's self up. When you hear the story, you experience that passion, right, to use the classic word, and feel it connecting to your own suffering and passion.
think
Thank you.
wonderful. I think just to add to that, I think this passage, of all the passages we've looked at so far, I've never come across so many different interpretations. If I look into the commentaries, so that you've mentioned one, Phil, and we've talked about several others together. But one of the key questions I think people have is about Jesus, the temple curtain being torn in two. You've described it in a certain way, and I've heard in my Christian life so many others from preachers who would say, actually, what that symbolizes, that curtain, is that the access to the presence of God into the Holy of Holies. It was only for one man in a year to do that, but now everyone is open to that now. Well, I get that, but I just wonder whether I can throw in another possibility, and also I fully affirm yours. It seems to me that these metaphysical, mystical, supernatural events that are happening at this point, the darkening of the sky, the blotting out of the sun, the tearing of the curtain in the temple, they need to be explained, and we can't just leave them. And I'm just wondering how they fit into Mark's overall kind of scheme, the pattern of thinking that we see earlier on in the gospel. And for me, what I think is being isolated early on in the gospel is Jesus being in many, it's the new covenant between God and mankind, Jews and Gentiles. That temple worship no longer is the way in which we come to know God.
Yeah.
And Jesus, in fact, is the new temple. Jesus talks about his own body, at least his accusers say he did, that if you destroy this temple, he will build it again in 3 days.
Yeah.
So Jesus is the new focus of worship, not the temple. And this is part of the good news for all mankind, not just the Jews, not just Israel. And the tearing of the curtain is the symbol of that, potentially. And the darkened sky, since I mentioned it, again, so many possibilities. Is this God the Father coming out in empathy for his son? Is it? Yeah, you think it is? Yeah. Or is it perhaps, and I'll mention it now I've started, is it perhaps something about judgment here? I mean, I'm thinking about a couple of references in the Old Testament, which maybe Mark's listeners would have known. The Exodus story where God sent a darkness over the whole land, and just before Israel is released by Pharaoh as a judgment. And then Amos, I think, is even clearer. It talks about in Amos 8, chapter 8, verses 9 to 10, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth in broad daylight in that day, which is the day of the Lord. So there is something going on perhaps in people's minds as they look at this darkness, they think about this darkness, that actually it means judgment on Israel, because the opportunity to follow God's plan, God's program, and believe in Jesus has been given them. But for many, the temple authorities certainly, they haven't taken it.
Well, and the temple's destroyed by the time the people hear this narrative in the form that we have it.
That's right.
Let me read. This is a description of the temple curtain from Josephus, who is a contemporary of, roughly a contemporary of Jesus. So he's seen the temple. He says it's a Babylonian curtain, so it's made in Babylon, embroidered with blue and fine linen and scarlet and purple, and of a contexture that was truly wonderful. Nor was this mixture of colors without its mystical interpretation, but was a kind of image of the universe. And it's 80 feet tall, he says somewhere else, right? So this is not a small thing. So it's significant that it's torn from the top to the bottom. I think it's clear that God is the one who's destroying this. I see it as God moving out rather than God drawing others in. But in Mark's gospel, it mirrors the very first event that happens, which is where the heavens are ripped at Jesus's baptism, and again, God's Spirit is out in the world, declaring that the reign has begun. And so at the very beginning and the end, we have this ripping of a barrier between whether it's one we imagine or that exists between God and humanity, and then God is drawing near. And I know one of the questions people ask is about what the centurion says. I say the executioner because to me that's part of he is a centurion. He's in charge of a lot of people, but he's also the one who's overseeing the execution. And so some people have interpreted it as a sarcastic statement by him, because everybody has said sarcastic things in Jesus's presence, right?
Yeah.
Like, this is the Son of God, right? That this is the evidence that it's not the case, is that interpretation. But I think the centurion has no idea what he's saying, but he's right. And when the temple curtain is torn, it's because God's Spirit is out in the world, that something impossible happens. The person most diametrically opposed to Jesus in that moment comes around to become the witness to what has just happened, whether he knows it or not.
Yeah.
Right. And so I don't see it as sarcastic. All the other taunts are introduced by things like, and they taunted him, saying, right. And this one doesn't have that. So I think it's provocative and it's interesting, and narratives can do different things in different moments, but I tend to see it as maybe he's just saying he's innocent. And in my head, he watches this guy die, and I don't know if you could see it, it was hard to do in the frame that we have, but he drops his spear as if to say, what am I involved in?
Yeah.
And so that's got a little bit of that judgment aspect. He's like, I'm involved with a system that put this guy of all people up on a cross. How in the world is that right? And so there's this, when God's Spirit is on the loose, even the enemies of God can become confessors of God.
Yeah,
Amazing.
I think that was one of the questions that came up, wasn't it, Phil? That I think it was Cliff, our good friend Cliff Barber, who asked, "Now, how do we perform this little bit of the centurion?" Would you like to answer that from your own point of view, and maybe I'll talk about mine? We'll probably find them quite similar.
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying, I think it's whatever he says we're to take as sincere, and I don't think it's sarcastic. Because, like I said, it's not introduced by the notion that it's a taunt. And I think it's the effect of God's Spirit on the loose, that he comes to a realization, or at least finds the words to say things. He might be saying, and I think Luke makes it, certainly this man is innocent. So it could be saying something. It's certainly not, a 3rd century declaration of what it means that Jesus is the Son of God. He doesn't have that formation to make that claim, but for those with ears to hear, and that happens even in the taunts, right? Yes. They think they're saying one thing, and yet the faithful here grasp something else, something deeper.
Exactly. I love the fact that this man is a centurion. First of all, actually, that means 100 men would be standing around that cross. And it's always struck me as a little bit odd that nothing's going to happen. Surely they're not going to come down from the cross. But I think bearing in mind Jesus' popularity hitherto, and the fact that you've got 2 guerrillas, insurrectionists on either side, it's probably a good thing that they've got 100 men there. I just think about this Son of God business, that one thing we haven't mentioned is that it kind of bookends, it's kind of like a bookend for the story, isn't it? Because at the beginning, Mark himself, in introducing the story, talks about Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And there are a couple of other incidents right at the beginning too, where the demons pronounce him the Son of God. So I think there's a kind of opening and closing with a key fact. And I agree, it's really difficult to know whether the centurion knew what he was saying, but like you, I do play it as if he is sincere, in contrast to the taunts. I just wonder, though, in terms of what it meant to the centurion. You say that he may have said it without understanding what he meant, but I'm even if that's the case, I wonder what it would have meant to either him or indeed to the audience, the Son of God. And those words they trip off the tongue so easily, don't they, for us modern people, us modern Christians. I don't think up to very recently I've given much thought to what those words actually mean, and especially in Mark. And it seems to me what they mean is Jesus is God's representation on earth. In other words, there's something about Jesus's divinity that's being explored here. It's not just that he happens to be genetically the Son of God. It's actually that who he is as a person is God himself, Yahweh in human form. And I think that would have been a common trope in the time of this story, that the emperor Augustus was called the Son of God. In other words, he is a deity. The pharaohs, some of them, were called the Son of God. Similarly, God in human form walking the earth. So the centurion saying this man is the Son of God could well be an actual genuine identification of the Godhead. But whatever the case, it is stirring end, isn't it, as to who Jesus is and what that means. Can I ask, Phil, what your thoughts are about the bit that comes immediately after the centurion speech? Because just as we were preparing for this podcast, I saw something I'd never seen before. That the next bit is about the women who are there watching. And what it says about them is that they followed Jesus and they served him. The NIV says they met his needs, but actually I think the original Greek is they served him. They followed him and they served him. And that reminded me of other passages, even ones which describe women like Simon's mother-in-law. They serve Jesus, they follow him and they serve him. In other words, these women are kind of archetypal examples of what it means to be a disciple.
Yeah, I think the word is the word we get deacon from.
Yeah.
And that in Acts, the deacons are the ones who care for the needs of people. This is one place where I'm like, Mark, if they were there the whole time, why didn't you tell us the stories, right? Yeah. I want to see them in action, serving and following. Why do you wait till the very end to let us know they're there?
But I have an answer for that, Phil. I have an answer, but you carry on.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah, I want to hear your answer.
Okay, this is just a shot in the dark. I'm sure I'll be argued out of court here, but this is what just occurred to me. I thought to myself, okay, so these women are left, and all the other disciples have gone. And I think this is not the only example where women who are the inferior class, as far as society at the time is concerned, are elevated in Mark's gospel. So some of them are named, many of them aren't. But in this case, they are elevated again. They love and serve Jesus, they follow him, and they don't desert him, albeit they're at a distance. All the other disciples, men, they've gone. And it just reminded me of a passage when Jesus talks to Peter, when Peter says to him, we've left everything to follow you. And Jesus says, well, no, if you follow me, you'll get so much more. And then he says, right at the end of that, the first will be last and the last will be first. And that kind of characterizes the topsy-turvy nature of this kingdom. The small, the minorities will be the most revered. And those who are arrogant, who see themselves as above, will be humbled. Here's what a living example of that the women who are the smallest are the ones who remain the longest. They're the last. They're the last to remain with him. And yet they're the first from Jesus's point of view.
And in that passage you're referring to, Peter gives them a list of things. He says, look, we've left everything. We've left children and mothers and fathers and fields and houses to follow you. And Jesus goes through the exact same list that Peter did, except he does it there and says, you'll get this 100-fold, but you don't get fathers 100-fold. So fathers are left off the list. And so it doesn't mean that there won't be men in the kingdom God's bringing, but it's saying we're not going to structure things in a top-down patriarchal father knows best way. We're going to create, I always think Rome is about a triangle and Jesus is about a circle.
Wow.
Where people stand on the same level and are eye to eye. And even Jesus isn't saying, let me be the top of the triangle in my imagination, although he's clearly the essential piece of it. It's one thing we didn't talk about is the breathing the last.
Yes.
Or no, the letting a loud cry is what the demons do when they are released from, I think it's the young boy who seems like he has epilepsy. When the demon comes out, it lets out a loud cry. So I don't know what we make of all these odd connections, these verbal threads or sonic echoes that are woven through the gospel, but they're there for some kind of reason. And maybe they're not. Maybe if we think I liked your point about sometimes the 2 points need to both be spoken and held in tension, and that we're supposed to stand in the tension, not resolve it in the direction we would like.
Yeah, absolutely.
Brilliant. I think we covered many of the questions. I would just, I don't think we quite covered this. What is it about thinking he was calling out Elijah in verse 35? I know we talked about Psalm 22. Why just Mark put that in about, it was just sounded as though they just misheard it.
I'll go first because I don't know the answer.
Go ahead.
And I think that the reason is I've been trying to work out, okay, where's Elijah focus? Where's the kind of references to Elijah in Mark, elsewhere in Mark? What's that got to do with the Old Testament? I can't find anything. And my answer is very bland, I'm afraid. It's simply they misheard. And the words do sound quite similar. So,
right.
Jesus speaking.
But Steph, there's always a reason. There's always a reason for the words in Mark.
I think what's more interesting is the man who gets the wine vinegar and the sponge, actually, and then said, let's see if Elijah comes to take him down. Yes, at that point, I think it is sheer mockery. It's sheer mockery. There's no sense in which there might be a theological underpinning at all. But Phil, any thoughts on Elijah?
So I too think that you're supposed to hear a pun that Eloi and Elijah run together. Jah sounds like a reference to God as well. I forget what Elijah means, but it probably is something of God. When Jesus is coming down I think it's when he's coming down from the Mount of Transfiguration, he says to them, they ask, why do the legal experts say that Elijah must come first? And he says, well, if Elijah comes to set everything right, then why is it written of him? So I think John the Baptist becomes the Elijah figure who's arrived, but those who don't buy that don't buy that. He's been accused of claiming to be the Messiah, and they know that Elijah's supposed to come first. So it's like, let's see if this is the moment, right? Like, this really looks like when Elijah's going to show up. But Elijah doesn't come to set things right, because although ultimately things do get set right, he's coming and entering into the death that we know so well, like John the Baptist does, again at the hands of another representative of Rome, dies. And so,
I think one of the questions that came up was about how could Jesus actually shout anything at this stage, as he'd been on the cross for some time, and it's likely that he would have been suffocating. I don't know how you feel about that. For me, it just points to the fact that this man somehow has strength and energy, divine strength and energy, to be able to shout out when most men would not be able to. And is it possible that's what's behind the centurion's amazement as he looks and he sees the way Jesus died? How could a man stay or shout anything at that point? It's impossible.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I don't know what to. That's not a question I've thought a lot about, so I don't have it. And it's interesting that none of the Gospels agree on what Jesus said on the cross. They all have different things. So, like in John, he's very chatty, right? Ranging for his mother's care and things. And so I feel like that we shouldn't forget that these Gospels are written a long time after. So to me, one of the most amazing things is they don't write down the story until a whole generation has passed, right? 30 some years is the oldest manuscripts after his death, 37 years, right? 70 AD is roughly when people think that grief takes a long time to process, and that they've processed this. They're trying to get the story right, because it doesn't make sense. For many of us Christians, the cross, and myself included, the cross is like the center of our faith. But it took the church a long time to figure out what to do with that. There are no representations of Jesus on a cross for the first like 150, 200 years. The only one that exists is graffiti insulting Jesus where it's a donkey on a cross. So it's like, this is a scandalous death. This is not something that immediately was seen as a gift from God. Except I believe that people experience connection with what happens to Jesus in they saw their story in that, as I was sharing in the student's story. And not just as individuals. I think the destruction of the temple and the crucifixions that followed it in 70 AD, that nobody had to describe what a crucifixion is like because they'd seen people they knew crucified. And so it's hard for us because when we think, name two people who are crucified, I'm Jesus, and we're out, right? What if you'd seen neighbors, men, women, and children who'd been crucified because they were either rebelling against Rome or were just in the wrong place at the wrong time? There's no due process in these crucifixions. And you'd seen thousands of people crucified. How could you not connect that, right? Like I imagine, Stefan, when you were talking about having to, in the midst of doing your performances, running back to your mom's bedside, how could you tell a story of Jesus raising Peter's mother-in-law without, feeling the vibrations those two stories shared? And I think throughout history that there's a wonderful New Testament scholar who's also a playwright, and he wrote a play about Mark. He writes books called Provoking the Gospel of Matthew, and his name is Richard Swanson. But in his performance of Mark, there's a narrator who comes out and recites all these tragedies of human history where genocides have taken place, and he so that we remember that what happens to Jesus happens all the time, but God has chosen to enter into that, not by entering into it, right? Not from a distance, as you said earlier, Stefan. And so, I think in this country, we're just remembering September 11th, 22 years ago. I lived in Chile for 2 years in the 80s. And so I think of the first September 11th, which was the coup d'etat that destroyed a government that was democratically elected. So my country was on the other side of that violence. And I think we're supposed to connect that. And sometimes we're doing it so that we experience God's closeness to us as the ones who are being the victims. And sometimes we're the centurion who needs to think about if we need to drop our sword and if we have done violence to the image of God in our midst.
Thank you very much. We're almost out of time. Is there one small thing that anybody wants to add to that? Or that's probably a good way to end.
Yeah, I think it's a great.
That's checking his notes.
I could say like a small thing that I have a Phil Ruge-Jones a YouTube video of the entire performance of Mark, that if you want to check it out, it's recorded. It's different than experiencing it live, but I'd invite you to find that.
Right.
I can send you a link and you can put that there.
And I'd like to invite you guys, if you're listening or watching this, look up the Gospel of Mark workshop, not mine, it's John Burnett. And he's got a really interesting article on that about the sponge and the wine vinegar.
Don't want to read it.
Maybe you don't want to read it. Okay, but we'll leave it there hanging, David.
Feel free. Phil, thank you so much, Phil Ruge-Jones, for taking your time to share your thoughts with us. It's been a real treat. And we've enjoyed having you too as well, lovely listener. That's all we have time for today. So it's goodbye from Phil Ruge-Jones in Wisconsin.
Indeed. Godspeed, you all.
Goodbye from Stefan Smart just down the road in Southampton.
Goodbye.
And from me until next time. There's not many more. Get your questions in for the next one. Goodbye.
If you enjoyed this episode of Question Mark and don't want to miss any future episodes, be sure to click on the subscribe button. This also means other people can find the podcast and join the conversation too. We'd also love if you could leave a review so we know what was good and what we can improve for future episodes. If you want to find out more about I Am Mark, Stephen Smart's solo word-for-word dramatisation of Mark's Gospel, go to www.sleek.bio/IamMark, where you can sign up for free for his newsletter and a whole host of other goodies. Join us and our special guests next time, where we'll continue to explore the greatest story ever told together. If you want to get involved with the podcast or have any questions or comments in the meantime, please do get in touch using the I Am Mark social media channels. We'd love to hear from you.
We light it up, we won't come down, and the sun can't stop us now. Watching it come true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show, where it's covered in all the colored lights, and the runaways are on in the night. Impossible comes true, it's taking over you. This is the greatest show.